Hello and welcome back. Now we'll start talking about the various types of threats that can affect our networks and essentially what we want to protect against as cybersecurity professionals. This is where it starts to get interesting. Before we get started, let's think about some other threats we might be familiar with. I used to work for a travel risk management company, and we advised global travelers about the risks they might face in various locations. Things like getting dengue fever in tropical locations, pickpockets, scams, people drugging your drink at the bar, that sort of thing. You'd think it would make me a bolder traveler, but it actually made me a more paranoid traveler. Anyway, the point is, there are many ways in the world that you can be threatened, and the same is true in the digital world. This lesson is all about learning some of the common threats we face so we can be prepared to protect against them. So, in this lesson, our objectives are to define common network threats and attacks and relate those things to the CIA triad. So, what do we mean by a threat? Here is the NIST definition. The parts I want to highlight for you are that a threat is something that directly impacts operational activities in a negative way. It can involve unauthorized access, which is confidentiality, modification of information, which is integrity, and denial of service, which is availability. It can also involve the exploitation of a particular vulnerability. So, what do we mean by vulnerability? Well, basically, it's a weakness in a piece of software or system. The MITRE Corporation maintains a list of common vulnerabilities and exposures known as CVEs. This is a list of known vulnerabilities, and they're each given a CVE number. And the idea is to make it easier to share information about these things so that cybersecurity strategies and systems can be updated to protect against them. I show an example of a CVE on the screen. This was a particularly bad vulnerability in the Log4j logging software, and the vulnerability was given the nickname Log4Shell. Log4j is used in so many applications that it's been hard for organizations to remediate this CVE, so it's had a really large impact as a result. Now, just because a CVE exists doesn't mean that attackers are exploiting it in the wild, but it leaves organizations open to being attacked, and they need to take steps to prevent that. Before we go further, here's some caveats. We'll only focus on certain basic types of attacks here, and it's not an all-inclusive list, but it'll give you a basic foundation to build upon. Once you get further in your cybersecurity career, I recommend also checking out our CVE series of courses, which covers several CVEs like I talked about in the last slide, and our OWASP Top 10 series of courses, which covers the top web-based attacks in depth as per the Open Web Application Security Project's list of top 10 web-based attacks. So, what is spoofing? We talked about spoofing before. It's essentially pretending you're something you're not. In the OSI model lesson, we talked about how attackers can spoof MAC addresses and IP addresses and redirect traffic that way. And you should be pretty familiar with this idea, but it's also something that comes up in phishing, which we'll talk about next. So phishing is where an attacker uses a form of social engineering to get the victim to do something. And typically it's through email, and the attacker's using spoofing. So they'll send an email that looks legitimate and entices the recipient to click a link or open an attachment. And this attack uses spoofing because the attacker usually poses as someone the recipient will trust. And the outcome of this type of an attack can affect any aspect of the CIA triad. There are many variations of this, such as spear phishing, where a target is a high-level individual usually, or vishing, where a malicious voicemail message is being used instead of an email. Phishing is really, really common. It's really, really dangerous. It's used all the time. I can't emphasize enough how important knowing about this type of attack is. Here is a screenshot from a July 2022 article I took from Bleeping Computer that was reporting on a group of hackers that had registered these domain names shown here that look so close to real Federal Credit Union domain names in the US that it would be hard for a victim to notice that they're not real. you can see that instead of FCU for Federal Credit Union in the domain, a lot of times they use FCV, which is really hard at first glance to notice. So phishing emails would tell the victim to click a link on with these domain names, and it would take them to some fake website that was probably really very sophisticated and looked real. And maybe the users would be enticed to change their password and give away their credentials and things like that. So very, very sophisticated, and things that when they come in your email spam filter might not catch them and things like that. So something we all need to be aware of, both in cybersecurity and just as regular citizens in the world. So, in a man in the middle attack, threat actors position themselves between the victim and some other entity and intercept the traffic. Imagine if you're logged into your online banking site and an attacker is able to intercept your password or account information, maybe change your account information with that. So it can affect the confidentiality of your information and the integrity of your information. And another term for this type of an attack is an on-path attack, which essentially means the same thing. The attacker is on that path between you and the site or service you're trying to access. So a denial of service attack is where the threat actor performs some action that either confuses or overloads a system, rendering it unavailable. So obviously the availability part of the CIA triad is affected here. It can also be a distributed denial of service attack where the attacker is using multiple computers to carry out the attack. This is, like I said, clearly affecting the availability part of CIA triad, and we'll talk about a couple other variations on this: oversized packet attack and fragment attack next. So a fragment attack, this is where the threat actor is able to intercept packets in transit between parts of a network and alter the normal fragmentation process in such a way that the target system cannot put the fragments back together again. Fragmentation is a normal process that breaks data packets down in a way that a receiving system can best ingest them, but a fragment attack interferes with that process and makes the system confused and not able to operate. So it's like a denial of service attack. An oversized packet attack is very similar to a fragment attack. In this case, the attacker is messing with how the size of the packet. So they make the packets too large for the receiving system to ingest them. And once again, this can overwhelm the system and make it unavailable. A remote code execution attack is one where an attacker can remotely execute malware on a target system. So the threat actor might have gained access to the target machine already, maybe through phishing or something like that, and will launch the malware remotely. And attackers can also take advantage of software already on the target system, and this is something called living off the land. A SQL injection is a type of attack that exploits websites that allow an attacker to pass malicious and insufficiently evaluated user input to a database in the back end, and specifically SQL databases. So if you've ever filled out a form on a website, you know that some forms force you to provide the input in a certain format, such as a date format or an email. And other forms you might encounter won't enforce that. They are not as secure, and a threat actor could go in there and type some kind of SQL code into the form, and it'll affect the back end, changing the database or the contents of the database in a nefarious way. Privilege escalation is where an attacker has somehow obtained access to your system and takes advantage of a vulnerability that allows them to gain higher privileges than they should have. So some software programs are written in such a way that a user can have greater access in certain circumstances, but if it doesn't double check that they should have the authorization or have the rights to that access, then attacker can take advantage of that. It's sort of like a loophole in the system. So a few more terms that you may already know, but just to make sure. A virus is a malicious software that needs a user to activate it. A worm is something that can propagate on its own once it's been activated on the network. So the user sort of only needs to activate it one time and then it can replicate itself. A Trojan is something that establishes future remote access for the attacker. So it's like a backdoor that the attacker can put in there and come back and have access to the system. Living off the land, we already mentioned, this is where a hacker uses capabilities and software that are already on the target network. And then a side channel attack is where a hacker gathers information from other aspects of a system, such as measuring emanations from a supply current or measuring the execution time for something to run. This can give the attacker valuable information that they can maybe use in other ways. So, to summarize, we talked about common types of network threats and attacks and how they relate to the CIA triad. Remember that there are many more variations of these attacks, and cyber criminals are constantly inventing new ways to attack systems all the time. So we have to keep learning and building upon this basic knowledge of attacks and, just paying attention to changes in the world as they're happening. And that's one of the biggest challenges in cybersecurity. The attackers never sleep, and we can't sleep either. So, anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one. So, welcome back. Now we'll get into the idea of building a secure network infrastructure. First, let's think about the blueprints for a house and think about what would happen if you designed it without something vital like a bathroom. Then, after you built it, you'd have to try to bolt that on later. It would be far better to build it in from the beginning, right? Because otherwise, you have to go back and try to add the plumbing afterwards. That would be so much harder. So, in this lesson, we'll explain why it's important to build in security from the ground up. We'll describe the needs for data security, and finally, we'll talk briefly about common cloud service and deployment models, since cloud and cloud security are so vital in today's networking environment. In order to make sure you have a secure network, you need to know all the parts and pieces that are in your network. This is often a complicated question for companies to answer. What is in my network? But if you think about it, you can't protect what you don't know you have, so you have to take inventory. Wireless and remote access to networks has added a new dimension to security that we all need to be aware of. So we'll be talking about that in this lesson as well. A key concept in network security is defense in depth. This means not just securing the perimeter of your network, but also every access point within your network. You may find that you need to use a password or other authentication method multiple times throughout your workday now. In the old days, you logged in one time and could access everything all day long. Not so anymore. Now, you may use something like single sign-on that allows you to log in one time, but in the background, the system is checking whether you have the proper access each time you use a new tool or access a different file. This is sort of like the layers of an onion. If you think about protecting just the perimeter, like the skin on the onion, that's sort of how we did it in the old days. But now we want to protect every layer, every point in between. Another concept here is zero trust, which means you trust no one by default and require authentication from everyone at every point. Another concept in network security is segmentation. This means partitioning your network into segments so that you can keep each segment secure. An example of segmentation is a so-called DMZ. The term is taken from the military demilitarized zone and is an area of your network that is connected to the external internet where threats may come from and is sort of a buffer to your internal network. It often contains a mail server and a web server to retrieve your email and your web traffic. In general, we think of our internal network as trusted, while our external networks like the internet are untrusted. But as I mentioned previously, we also have to start thinking about zero trust, such that everything is considered untrusted until properly authenticated, even inside your internal network. Now that a lot of our networks are hosted in the cloud and people are working remotely more than ever, the concepts of VLAN and VPN are more commonplace. A VLAN is a virtual LAN, and it's a logical subset of a physical LAN that designates certain nodes within that LAN to be on their own separate VLAN, keeping them protected from the rest of the network. A VPN encrypts your internet traffic and provides a more secure environment in which to work. During the pandemic, companies found it necessary to make sure users were working from home and were on the VPN, so IT admins could enforce security since they couldn't be sure whether an employee's home network was secure. To defend our network after building in security from the ground up, we need to detect threats and prevent threats. Ways that we can detect threats are through the use of intrusion detection systems. This type of system monitors the network and detects potential threats, then sends alerts to network defenders so they know about them and can take action. A SIEM, or SIEM, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is a security information and event management tool. Because the amount of data coming from an IDS and other logs and systems can be a lot, a SIEM is designed to help SOC analysts and admins filter that monitoring data so they can see the signal through the noise and determine when they need to take action and when they can ignore something. Other tools that are used are also helping you protect and prevent intrusions. So these include things like an antivirus software or a vulnerability scan that detects the known viruses and malware and blocks them. It also includes intrusion prevention systems that both detect and prevent threats. And just remember the difference between an IDS and an IPS is that an IPS not only detects something, but also prevents it. Think of the old days and how we had records and CDs. Now we have Pandora and Spotify and digital libraries where we can check out virtual media. If you want to listen to a collection of Frank Sinatra's greatest hits, you can just request it and have it at your fingertips. But today we have virtualization, and this is similar. Say you need a server to do X, or you need a database to support your new application. You can, in a sense, request it and have it available to you. You don't need a physical medium, or a physical machine, rather. Companies used to need to maintain their own on-premises data centers. And while some companies today still maintain their own data centers and infrastructure, they are also likely to have at least some things in the cloud, which is a virtualized version of the infrastructure. But it's important to remember that even the cloud is made up of real physical data centers. They're just located some other place. And data centers require power, HVAC, fire suppression, and redundancy to be, secure and protect your data and, sufficient to do the things you need it to do. And by using cloud services, companies don't have to maintain all that. They can pay a provider to do that for them. So here are some cloud deployment models. And we'll talk about these, and you'll probably want to remember these because they can be a little bit confusing between the different names. A public cloud is one that we're most familiar with. This is where a cloud service provider provides the cloud for use by various different companies. So, the company you work for, any other company you worked for before, they might all be using this type of a cloud deployment model where they subscribe to services from AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud as examples. A private cloud is where a company owns its own cloud architecture and it's not shared with any other entities. A hybrid cloud is a case where a company uses architecture that relies on both having a public cloud and having the company's own private cloud and on-premises infrastructure. And a community cloud is where multiple organizations share cloud resources and services based on common operational needs. Cloud service models. So there are more than just the ones we're going to talk about here, but these are some basic cloud service models that you should know, and they represent the varying degrees to which a cloud service provider is responsible for various aspects of infrastructure and applications and so forth. So with SaaS, software as a service, the provider is providing for almost all aspects of the infrastructure and applications. I remember this one by thinking that in this model, the provider has a lot of SaaS because they're doing most of the stuff for the client. With PaaS, which is platform as a service, the cloud service provider is responsible for the infrastructure and the operating system. And the client is responsible for securing the application's data, user access, and that sort of thing. And then with IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, the cloud service provider is only responsible for providing and securing the infrastructure. The client is responsible for all else. So I remember this by thinking that if I'm the client, the I in IaaS means I'm responsible for the most stuff, and the cloud provider is just responsible for the infrastructure. So in this lesson, we discussed how it's important to build security in from the ground up. And we talked about ways that we build security with, build a secure network with things like segmentation, zero trust, using VPNs and things of that nature. And we also talked about cloud service models and cloud deployment models and just sort of the basics that you need to know there. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.